Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to today's Radio Centre Ireland webinar. It is the last webinar of 2024. We've some very exciting webinars coming up again in 2025. But for today, we're going to focus on the Irish audio report. And I'm delighted to introduce Karen Hall from Ipsos, who's going to go through the report with you in a very short while. But before Karen starts talking through the Irish audio report, I just want to remind everybody of all the other research that is out there and available to you in terms of understanding audio and its role within the marketing media mix. So in October 24, we launched the Generation Audio Ireland report. So that's October 23, it should be. And that is where it looks at the different need states, the reasons why people consume live radio, why they consume streaming, and why they consume podcasts. And what it actually shows is they're very complementary because they provide different needs for audiences. So rather than competing, they're very much complementary audio formats. In May 23, we launched a campaign FX Performance Multiplier, which looked at how audio drives website traffic. Some really interesting data on that and showed that radio and audio is very good and very effective at driving website traffic. There tends to be a delay in response, unlike TV. So rather in TV, where the responses are very quick, in audio, it takes a little bit longer for those responses to happen. In April 2024, it was a UK piece of research, but we did a webinar, provided all the data on it as well, called Listen Up, and it looks at creative best practice. How do you create the best possible type of audio to deliver long-term brand effectiveness? Some really interesting insights within that. And then in March 2024, we had the Campaign FX Brand Multiplier, the Performance Multiplier in May. We just looked at performance. The one in March 2024 looked at more upper funnel metrics such as brand consideration, brand awareness, and purchase intent, and showed that brands who use radio and audio are far better at delivering brand awareness, brand consideration, and purchase intent. And then finally, quite recently at the Sending Out 2024 event last month, we released a mental availability study which looks at how when audio complements AV, it delivers greater opportunities for people to remember the brand, for that brand to spring to mind at a purchase occasion. So again, just to remind everybody the breadth of research that's out there, it's all on the website. You can contact me directly, but all those resources are on the website. But today, what we're here to talk about is the Irish Audio Report. It is part of the JNLR ecosystem. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the JNLR, which essentially shows and provides data on what radio stations and what programs people listen to. But as part of the JNLR system, we also delve into total audio listening, and that is what the Irish Audio Report today is about. So it looks at share of listening, what percentage of time is spent listening to live radio versus podcasts versus streaming, and also look at the percentage of consumers who pay for a streaming service or a YouTube premium service, which is ad-free. It also looks at connected devices and looks at how people consume audio, what device they consume it on, and where they consume audio. Do they consume it out and about, at home, and in the car? So there's a huge amount of really valuable insight that we're going to go through today. And I'm delighted to now hand over to Karen, who's going to go through the report in detail for you. Just before Karen starts, just to say, please put any questions in the Q&A bar at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to them at the end. And the full written report will be available from tomorrow, and I will send it directly to you by email, and you'll be able to read through all the details of the report. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Kieran, very much, and thanks everybody for joining in today. Kieran gave a little bit of background, so just to give a little bit more detail on that in terms of an overview. So as part of the JNLR interview, in Q2 every year, we have a special module attached to the interview, which delves into the whole area of other audio formats, as Kieran explained. So It is a JNLR interview, so we are basing this research on a large sample size of over 3,000 people across all franchise areas in the country. And it's the same sample of individuals who answered the JNLR survey. So for today, we're going to look first of all at technology, what relevant tech people own and subscribe to. We look a little bit in detail at the audio market. This will be the most detailed area, the patterns of listening on a weekly and daily basis to audio and the various different formats. We will look at our daily environment, where are we listening? What are we listening on? And then I'll briefly summarize all of those pieces at the end. So just if we move to the first section. Okay, so Irish audiences are highly connected. We know that now. We know, for example, that there's almost universal access to broadband and almost universal ownership of smartphones at 90 and 92% respectively. Currently, we have a figure of that 44% of people own voice-activated tech or a smart speaker. And we'll look at that in a little bit of more detail over the next couple of charts. And 55% own a Bluetooth wireless headphone. So this is empowering audiences, I suppose, to listen into audio when they're on the move. So when we look a little bit more in detail at the smart speaker and the voice-activated tech, which is, I suppose, becoming the new kitchen radio in one way, we see that there's been significant growth of smart speakers since 2019. But the pace of acceleration is beginning to slow down now. We see the current position at 44%, which is almost identical, 1% down compared to last year. So significant growth in the early years as that technology began to be rolled out, and now it's becoming more mainstream and the pace is slowing somewhat. When we look a little bit in more detail at the ownership levels, we can see that ownership of smart speakers is higher among the younger cohorts, and this is typical with other tech product ownership as well. So this is a pattern that we would tend to see. But so for example, we can see that among 15 to 24-year-olds, 59% of this group own smart speakers now. 50% of the 25 to 44 group own a smart speaker. 46% of the 45 to 64 group, and 20% of the 65 plus group. So we can see that, as I said, ownership is higher among those younger groups, but is becoming more mainstream across the age spectrum when we look at the 45 to 64 age group. And particularly in the older group, we can see there was some growth in the last year from 15% to 20%. So it is spreading across the age groups and becoming a more mainstream product for people to own. In terms of what people are subscribing to and whether people pay to subscribe to audio content, this is a question that we added in 2023. So irrespective of the levels of usage of these subscriptions, over a third of the population, 36%, say they own one or other of these subscriptions currently. We can see, for example, paid subscriptions to audio streaming among the total population. 31% they currently have a subscription to audio streaming. This increases among the younger group, particularly those 15 to 24, at 50%. Among the 25 to 54s at 41%, and in the older group at 19% among the 45 plus group. And in fact, most of that group are indeed those people who are aged under 65. Much fewer are paying to subscribe to YouTube Premium. Currently, among the 15 plus population, 10% say they subscribe. And again, it is higher at 16% among those 15 to 24-year-olds. Also, we have 9% of people who say they pay a subscription to a podcast. Obviously, you know, there'll be a lot of people who might subscribe to one that they follow and then obviously access other free ones. But currently 9% say they subscribe to at least one podcast. And again, higher among the younger groups. And in this particular occasion, 13% of those aged 25 to 44 say they subscribe, and this is the highest across those different age groups. It's marginally higher than the 15 to 24s. Interestingly, though, the subscription levels has dropped in the last year by 2 percentage points. So this data here shows any subscription to any of those three that we measured. And currently we see that at 36% in 2024, and last year it was at 38%. So it has dropped by those 2 points since we first measured it. It is a small drop. It could be a reflection of people, you know, of users cutting back on their discretionary spending in the context of the cost of living crisis that we're undergoing. It could be that they're streamlining their paid for audio and paid for video content, in fact, because of those issues. So we will build that pattern and picture up over time going into the future. And when we look at the individual ones, the second pair there, 33% in 2023 said they'd paid a subscription to audio streaming. That's also down by 2% to 31% now. Paid subscriptions to YouTube has dropped by 3 percentage points to 10% now. And subscribing to podcasts has also dropped from 11% in 2023 to 2024. We do see, though, however, that paid subscriptions to online audio platforms have decreased among the younger groups. And when you look then across the older groups, those aged 45 to 64 and 65 plus, the pattern is very steady compared to last year. So the dynamic is happening around those younger groups among the 15-24s and among the 25 to 44s, where in the first instance, the drop was a bit more marked, from 59% last year to 54% this year. And in the second group, 25 to 44s, from 51% to 48% this year. So a little bit of drop. And as I said, the activity, the changing in patterns is happening among those younger groups. So we're going to look now at some more detail around, you know, the patterns of listening to the various audio formats in this market, including live radio, including podcasting, including streaming, and so on. So we can see that there's almost universal listening to audio content. 97% of the population say they tuned into some audio content in the past week, and that represents 4.2 million people. So it's a huge market, lots of people listening, lots of ears tuned in. So that is a great story for radio and for all audio as well. When we look at it in a little bit more detail, sorry, moving on. Oh, sorry, I moved on too quickly there. We can see that almost 90% of people listen to live radio in the past week. And it is very interesting to see that radio continues to attract these sizable audiences in such a busy environment that we now have across audio formats and also in the audio visual space. You know, there's so many different apps and content vying for listeners' and viewers' attention. So almost 90% listen to radio in the past week, and this compares to 55% who listen to some on-demand online audio in the past week. If we looked at that in a little bit more detail and look at the individual strands of what people are listening to, live radio there is the dominant format of audio listening across this group at 90% listening. 38% of people say they tuned in to listen to music streaming, the next biggest competitive format. 30% say they listen to YouTube for music. 22% say they listen to a podcast in the past week. 18% to listen to their own music. and 6% said they listened back to on-demand Irish radio. So as I said, live radio is the dominant format in this marketplace. And I suppose it's not really surprising. You know, there's a lot of things we already know about radio by its nature. It lends itself to larger audiences. It's easy to listen to. It's available at the touch of a button. There's no searching for content and so on. And it also delivers on some of those key human needs that Kieran, one of the Radio Centre's presentations showed us last year. You know, those key human needs of providing a social space, connection to the outside world. So it's not particularly surprising that live radio is in that leading position there. And interestingly as well, we see very similar patterns to this in the UK, our nearest neighbours. That from recent research published by Rajar, the Midas report, that showed that patterns of listening were very similar. Live radio in the UK is at 88%, music streaming is at 39%, so almost identical to ours. Podcasting is at 23%, almost identical to where we find our patterns in Ireland. So in the broader market outside of Ireland, we're kind of following similar patterns. When we look at a little bit of trend over time, we can see here a five-year trend. And while we can see that, you know, there has been some erosion in live radio over the past 5 years. In 2019, it was at 93%. It's now at 92%. And all formats are actually a little bit lower than they had been this year compared to previous. So there is more, you know, while there's huge numbers of people tuning in, there is a little bit of erosion in those markets. However, so it's perhaps a bit more dynamic to consider the other formats outside live radio, which has remained relatively steady. You can see that green line along the top of the chart there. But when we look at something like, for example, our own music, back in 2019, you know, 36% of people were tuning into their own music archives, whether that was CDs or vinyl or downloads or whatever it might have been. And that's now at a current position of 18%. And when it looks like, you know, what we've seen in the patterns over time is that music streaming has effectively replaced much of our own personal downloads. As own music was dropping down a little bit, we could see that music streaming was increasing over that period of time to the current position of 38%. But as I said, a little bit of a drop across all formats, with the exception of podcasts since 2023, and the podcast listening at 22% is remains steady compared to 2022. So a little bit of movement, reasonably steady though, and the dynamic, I suppose, across the broader trend showed a bigger increase in music streaming from 26% to the current 28%, a bigger increase for podcasting. We can see the growth over the trend over the periods there from 2019 and so on. Listening back to Irish radio has remained steady as well over those years. So quite an interesting pattern to see that. If we look at the same pattern among the 15 to 24-year-olds, you know, this group are more likely to embrace digital formats compared to the older groups. But nonetheless, weekly listening to all formats has dropped over the years. So the engagement across all audio formats among this particular younger age group has dropped a little bit over time. And again, it's probably to be expected given all of those other video and audio content that is vying for our attention, and particularly the attention of these young people in the current environment. We looked in particular at a couple of audiences for this particular chart. So this shows the profile of listeners to the profile of the audio streaming listeners, for example, the profile of the podcast listeners, and the profile of YouTube listeners. And this is a profile in terms of their listening, those listening who are subscribers versus free users. So for example, if we take the first pair there on the left, we can see that 66% of all audio streaming listeners are actually paid up subscribers using that service to listen, compared to 34% who are using the free service. The opposite is kind of flips when we look at podcast listeners. We can see that 28% of podcast listeners in the past week are paid up subscribers to at least one podcast versus 72% who are free subscribers. And similarly for YouTube listeners, 22% in this instance are paid up subscribers and 78% are free users. So a significant proportion of regular audio streamers are paid up subscribers. And this, of course, means they're listening to ad-free content as they're listening to their audio content. When we look a little bit at the younger groups at a little bit in more detail, so this is looking at the various audio formats across those key age groups that we've seen. So we can see in particular that the more digital formats, there's higher use of that, or higher listening recorded among 15 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 44-year-olds, higher than the average. We can see 73% of those younger people are listening to music streaming, for example, 50% of 25 to 44-year-olds. It's a similar pattern across YouTube for music. It's more prevalent among the younger age groups, and for podcasting as well. Interestingly, the podcasting really hits its mark here among the 25 to 44-year-olds. So they're the biggest market there for podcasting. So what we've looked at there is the weekly pattern. You know, how many people tuned in to the various audio aspects, audio formats on a weekly basis. Now we can look at the much more regular listeners, you know, those who tune in every day. And we can see from this chart that online demand is a more occasional format to listen to than live radio, for example. We can see here that overall radio is the number one choice, and it's the number one choice by a significant margin. When we look on the left of this chart, this is the total population age 15 plus. We can see that almost 8 in 10 are listening to live radio every day, and every day being defined as the average yesterday listening day. And this compares to 24% for those music streaming, 14% for YouTube for music, 8% for own music, and 9% for podcasts, and 2% listen back to an Irish program every day. So very much the online on demand. As I said, the growth in listeners grows over the week, and then we add more listening if we extend that period over to the past month, for example. When we look at, though, on the right-hand side of the chart, this is the 15 to 24-year-olds. Again, this group tends to be the most dynamic group. We see early adoption happening here, obviously, and a lot more activity going on here. And we can see in this instance that music streaming is a significant competitor. 55% of this group are listening to music streaming on a daily basis, compares to 65% for live radio. So live radio is still in the leading format among this group. So there is significant competition among this group, but we do know, and we will see later, that even among this group, when they're listening to on demand online, they tend to listen for a shorter period of time compared to live radio. As part of the interview, once we identified the different formats that people were listening to, and we established that measure of reach, respondents then focused on their listening activity yesterday. And we asked them to estimate the time they spent listening to the various formats. And this estimate was based on a scale. So for example, from 0 to 15 minutes, 15 to 13 minutes, 31 to 60 minutes, and so on. So we were asking them to think, for example, you said you listened to a podcast yesterday. About how long did you spend listening to podcasts yesterday? And from this question, we see that audiences tend to listen to on demand for shorter periods of time compared to radio. So we can see here that live radio, it achieves more, a higher reach, and those people who are listening tend to listen for a longer period of time compared to listen back, compared to music streaming, YouTube Music, Own Music, all the other online formats tend to, while they engage people to the extent that we saw, they tend to listen for a shorter period of time. And this kind of makes intuitive sense. Well, it does to me anyway, I think, because for on demand, a listener actively chooses and searches for their content. It's effortful. And of course, then, if we're talking about podcasting, these tend to be based on episodes. So an episode can be as short as 15 minutes, or it can be as long as an hour. I know that. But the choosing and the searching, it's a different dynamic than switching on the radio and listening and leaving it on in the background, for example, if you're doing some other things. So it is a very different dynamic. But obviously then, when we see how that pattern of listening falls out, that naturally impacts on the share of time spent. So when we establish or analyze how that information that we saw on the previous chart looks in terms of the share of time spent, we naturally see that live radio commands the highest share of listening across all the formats. And currently in 2024, live radio has a share of 75.5%. So remember, more people are tuning in and they tend to spend longer. So that naturally is driving this larger share figure for live radio. This compares to music streaming. When we're able to break out the music streaming by paid and music streaming free, we're assuming that those people who have paid for streaming are using that service to listen when they're listening. And in this instance, we see that paid for music streaming commands a 9% share, music streaming free 2.6%, Own Music then has a 3% share, Listen Back to Irish Radio is 0.5% share, podcasting has 3.4% share, and YouTube paid premium 1.6% share, and YouTube free at 4.3% share. We've looked at that then across, again, that younger dynamic group, those 15 to 24-year-olds. And we do see a different pattern here. We see that when we combine all of the on-demand audio, that its share as a combination is higher than for live radio. But indeed, live radio does have the highest share among this age group at 46.2%. That's followed by music streaming, the next highest, paid for music streaming at 23.4% share. Music streaming free has a share of 7.8%. Own Music 7.2%. Listen Back 0.3%. Podcasting has a share of 3.2% among this group. And YouTube paid at 4.2% and YouTube free at 7.6%. So the market does look very different when we're looking at these younger age groups in terms of their share for live radio versus on demand. But again, live radio is when you look at the individual formats, live radio is in the leading position there. We can see how the share is looking over time. So we have a trend pattern here going back to 2020, 2021. So the trend, there has been fluctuations across all formats, and the shifts year to year, they tend to be reasonably small. So, for example, in the last year, we could see that share to YouTube Music and Own Music had dropped marginally since 2023. And because this is a measure of share, when we're looking at all the minutes listened to all the formats combined, every other format then increased a little bit, including live radio. They all gained another little bit. So we can see that the comparison from 2023, live radio was almost 74%. It's now 75.5%. Listen back gained very marginally there. Music streaming gained from 11.6% to 11.8%. YouTube was down slightly, own music was down slightly, and we see that podcasting gained slightly from 3.2% to 3.4%. But if we did look at the broader trend back to 2029, as I said, the fluctuations do happen year on year. And those fluctuations tend to be reasonably small. But we do see over the longer trend, the small drop in live radio. In 2021, it was at 78.8%. It's now at 75.5%. And the increases there then for music streaming from 10% to the current 11.8%, and for podcasting from 1.7%, its share has almost doubled to 3.4%. So in the broad trend, there is that bit of erosion for live radio and a little bit of growth for music streaming, but it is a reasonably slow pace of change. So the previous charts, we were able to see, the share for music streaming paid and music streaming free, and YouTube Premium paid and YouTube Premium free. So obviously not all audio is available for advertising. We saw earlier that the reasonably significant proportion of music streamers and YouTube listeners, they do listen to their premium paid for content. And of course, then we also listen ad-free to our own archives. So when we reanalyze the share and take into account those non-addressable audiences, in other words, when we remove the minutes to paid for music streaming and paid for YouTube, a very different picture emerges. So we can see in this instance now that live radio increases to almost 88% of all audio. Music compared to music streaming free at 3.1%, listen back to Irish radio at 0.6%, podcasts at 3.9%, and YouTube music at 4.9%. So a very different picture has emerged once we look at the addressable audiences and exclude those paid for content listeners. Okay, so the next section, we're going to look at our daily environment, and this is going to show us, really answer the questions where we are when we listen, and what device do we use to listen on. So the first chart just looks at a broad overview. These are, I suppose, the highlights. And these questions were asked specifically in relation to what people were doing yesterday. They told us they listened to streaming or live radio or podcasting or whatever it was yesterday. And then we probed further and asked, well, when you were doing that, where were you and what were you listening on? So we know that 71% of the population listen to audio at home, and 43% listen to audio in the car. Almost 68%, so 7 in 10 people almost, are using a radio or music system. So in other words, a radio or a CD player or their turntable, for example, if they're playing vinyl, to listen to their audio content, compared to the next highest one of smartphone at 30%. So in-home is definitely the most common place to listen to audio content, followed by the car. We look at a little bit more detail at some of this information on the next slide. So we can see this particular chart looks at a few of the key age groups, 15 to 24s, 25, 44s, and 45 pluses. So most listening, you can see there, happens at home for all age groups. But younger people are more engaged with audio outside the home compared to the average. So for example, we see that in home, as I said, the at home is the highest across all the age groups. When we look at listening at work or school or college, we can see that it's higher than average among those 15 to 24s, where 16% of this group say they listen to audio in that environment, and 14% of the 25 to 44-year-olds listen to audio in their work or school or college environment. Also, when we're out walking and cycling and running, 8% of the total population listen to audio in that environment, but that increases to 18% among the younger 15 to 24s and 10% among the 25 to 44-year-olds. A small amount of listening happening on the bus and the train, 2% of people say they listen, again increasing among that younger group. 7% of the 15 to 24s are listening, when they're on the train. If we take an example of that 18% among that young group who are listening as they're out walking, cycling and running, in that environment, music streaming is the most popular format among this cohort when they're out and about. 11% are listening daily to music streaming. When we're at home, which is the most popular place or the most common place to listen, live radio is the most common format or the most popular format to listen when at home. And 56% are listening at home to live radio each day. So the next chart looks at listening to audio in the car in a little bit more detail. So we know that overall 43% of people said they listened in the car. And this chart shows that listening broken out by some of the key age groups. We can see when we look at the trend chart and when we look at the total trend for car listening, we did see a significant jump between 2021 and 2022. And this is obviously, coming back in the post-COVID environment as things began to get normal. We weren't locked down anymore. We were able to move about. And that pattern has continued since that time, even though the increases are a little bit more marginal each time. We can see that the in-car listening is higher among the 25 to 44-year-olds. Currently, 50% of that group listen in the car to audio. 46% of the 45 to 64s are listening in car currently, and 31% of those aged 65 plus. So there has been growth year on year across those age groups, but the highest listening is among those 25 to 44-year-olds. Live radio is the preferred format in car. Almost 40% are listening to live radio in the car daily. A small proportion, only 5%, are listening to audio streaming in the car. In terms of the device that's used, we do see that significant proportions are using a connected device, but the radio is still the traditional radio or CD player or whatever, that music system still is the most used device to listen. So even while our world is becoming more digital and increasingly digital, despite that, the traditional devices are still quite strong there. So that's followed by 30% who say they use the smartphone. So that's the next most popular device used to listen. So 30% are using their smartphone daily to listen. 10% are using their smart speaker, and that does increase when we look at those people. Obviously, that's 10% of the total population are using a smart speaker. It increases obviously among those who own a smart speaker. Naturally enough, you'd expect that. 8% are listening via a laptop or PC, 3% via their tablet, 2% via a TV screen, and 3% with using an other system. And when we look at some key age groups here, again, we see some of the key age groups, 15, 24, 25, 44, and 45 plus. We see that the traditional device is more popular among the older age groups. That's probably not surprising. 77% of those aged 45 plus are using the radio system or the radio every day. The smartphone is the most used device among the younger groups, however, among the younger 15 to 24 group anyway. We see that 56% of this group, of the 15 to 24-year-olds, are using their smartphone to listen to audio, and this is the leading device among this group. Among the 25 to 44-year-olds, a significant proportion of those are also using their smartphone to listen, though it's less than for the radio device. And among that younger group, the 15 to 24s, 43% of them are listening to streaming on their mobile phone daily. If we want to look particularly at the smart speaker consumption and that smart speaker activity, we see that currently 10% of people, of the total population, are listening to audio daily on their smart speaker. As I said, this does increase among those who own a smart speaker. It increases to 22% of owners listen to audio on that speaker every day. There's marginal growth year on year when we're looking at the various age groups. When we look at 25 to 44s, we can see a growth from 12% to 13%. Among the 45 to 64s, from 10 to 11%. In the 65 pluses, it's actually gone down 1 point. It wouldn't be a significant point. So it is growing, but it is growing at a quite a slow pace and showing marginal growth year on year. They're the key findings that we have. So I'm going to just review some of those key points before we finish up. So we can see that against that backdrop of significant competition for our attention in the AV sector, audio content does reach significant proportions of the adult population on a weekly basis and on a daily basis. We know that Irish audiences have significant digital connections, almost universal ownership of smartphones at 92%, and broadband. Smart speakers current ownership at 44% and wireless headphones at 55%. So while they're not all using these devices every day, hopefully that audio listening will grow as time moves on. In 2024, then, there's almost universal engagement in the audio market, as we said, on a weekly basis. Almost 9 in 10 people are listening to audio every week. And radio continues to be the dominant format in that sector. Excuse me. However, despite that strong performance, we have seen that listening levels across live radio and digital formats have dropped slightly since 2023. Excuse me, one moment. I'm very sorry. Something's caught in my throat. Audiences tend to listen to on demand for shorter periods of time. The opposite is true for radio. More people are listening to radio and stay tuned in for longer. And this, of course, naturally impacts on the measure of share listened, the measure of share of minutes. On an average day, in terms of estimated time spent, live radio does have the major share of listening at 75.5%. Share to YouTube and home music has dropped since 2023, and all the other formats have gained a little bit since that time. There's a small decrease in the proportion of individuals who have a paid subscription for audio content since 2023. Streaming, YouTube or podcasts, it now stands at 36%, which reflects a drop of 2% in the past year. We saw that at home is the natural environment for listening to audio, and it remains the most used location. However, listening in the car has increased to 43%, which is plus 2% since last year. 30% of people use a smartphone. Sorry, I'm going too far. Oh dear. We see that 30% of people use a smartphone to listen to audio content on an average day, and this increases to 56% among the younger 15 to 24-year-olds. And furthermore, 1 in 10 use a smart speaker to listen on a daily basis. Sorry for the coughing fit there at the end, but that kind of finishes what I wanted to say. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has anything they want to ask or to clarify. Thank you.
Many thanks, many thanks, Karen. And sorry, I hope you're okay. You had that coughing spell at the end. So we're just going to unshare the screen now, and then we're just going to take a few questions from people. There's quite a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to go into them now, Karen, and ask those questions. So the first one is, for live radio, do we ask Irish versus international radio station listenership similar to the podcast question? You're on mute there.
Yeah. No, we talk about, listen to live radio. We don't specify that it's Irish versus international, but it is Irish radio that we're talking about, because we know anecdotally that most of the listening in Ireland is to Irish radio. There's very little that would of listening to other international stations.
Okay. Then the second question is, can you explain the drop from 21 versus 22, where average minutes for music streaming is half the figure for live radio?
So can we explain, so will you say that again, Kieran? Is it the share?
Yeah. Can you explain the drop from 21 versus 2022, where average minutes for music streaming is half the figure for live radio?
So the question probably relates to the share of listening there. So we could see that in terms of share, there was a small drop to, I'm not sure if it is share that person is actually asking about.
Average minutes, so that's share, I assume, average minutes.
Okay, so as we saw, when we asked people to tell us what they were doing yesterday and in the past week and in the past month and so on, we have the largest format that people are listening to is live radio, and music streaming follows after that. But when we then ask them to talk about, the amount of time that they actually spend when they're listening, we can see that to those digital formats, to those on-demand formats, people are listening for less time. So consequently, the share, that feeds into the share. More people listening for longer feeds into a larger share for live radio, and fewer people listening for a bit less has reduces obviously the share for those on-demand digital. So streaming, the share figure I think had remained reasonably steady. Let me just see if I can find that. The share figure had remained steady for music streaming year on year. The little drop had happened for YouTube and for own music, and that was shared out among all those other formats. I'm not sure I got the right piece of information to answer that question, Kieran, but hopefully it does.
And if any person wants to, if you want to follow up with a subsequent question, just put it in the chat. The next question I'll probably answer, Karen, I'll just read it out. Is there any evidence that engagement is lower for live radio listening than on demand, i.e. it's more likely to be more in the background, but listeners may not always be listening so intently? Well, I'll answer that first, Karen. You might follow up. I suppose the best answer to that, I think, is the piece of research we did called Generation Audio, which was released last year, and it's on the website. And I think it's just a different type of listening. So basically what that research shows is that people listen to live radio to be connected to the outside world and get a sense of energy about their environment. So you get a connection knowing that different people are listening at the same time and they're kind of connected to the outside world, but it delivers a sense of energy to them. While podcast listening, the main motivation was learning new things, broadening their horizon, and streaming was much more about mood management. It was much more about just in terms of being an accompaniment to what people are doing in terms of the music they're listening to. So there's really huge amount of detail in that research. What's quite interesting is that in terms of that research, what I think it does show is that how you show up from an advertising point of view, I think is quite key. And actually, also, if people have time, if they go onto the Sounding Out 2024 tab on the website and go into Ralph van Dijk's presentation, he talked very clearly about that kind of lean in and lean back situation when you're consuming audio, and for brands to really understand the environment by which people are listening and to make sure the brand message is relevant. I give the example of the people that are listening to music streaming now. That's kind of replaced going back when I was kind of a young fella growing up. You listen to your
The
CDs,
tapes.
your record players. It was your own music, and now people use streaming to get the music they want to listen to. So I think when you place an ad in that environment, you have to be careful how you place it because you're interrupting people's music they want to listen to. Also, in a podcast environment, depending on the podcasting environment, how an ad shows up, I think you have to be careful how you do that. While live radio is very different because there's a program, there's an ad break, there's a mixture of ads, and you go back to the program, and it's kind of structured in a way that people expect. So I think it's worth potentially, if people will have time, to look at the Ralph van Dijk presentation that's on the website. So I think that answers it to some degree. In terms of intensity, it's probably something we haven't measured directly, but I do think all audio to some degree is a passive experience. So people can be doing other things while they're listening. And there's research in the UK that things show that up to 90% of all audio occasion listening is accompanying some other task at the same time. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic for brands on how to use that situation to provide messages that are relevant to people in certain environments. The next question is, how has the number of total audio minutes changed from 21 to 2024? I'm not sure if the report actually measures total audio minutes as a universe, but that's the question there, Karen. So has the total
Yeah,
audio minutes changed from 21 to 24?
it has, but very, very marginally. And again, we do measure these minutes in a different way than we do for our core JNL or interview, where we look at 15 minutes by 15 minutes and so on. The way we measure it here is we ask people to estimate using that scale I mentioned earlier, 0 to 15 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, and so on, 30 to 60 minutes and so on. And we get our averages from that question. There was a change. I don't have it on me at the moment, but it was quite marginal and quite small based on that question.
Okay.
But we do see, sorry, Kieran, we do see, that overall in terms of reach, as I had mentioned, that there is a marginal drop in reach, but it is only marginal compared to the previous year. So still huge numbers tuning into audio, but marginally down. And we do, it is such a competitive environment, isn't it now? With all of the other AV content, visual content, no mind just audio content that people are choosing. So it's quite interesting to see how audio still is holding up so well in that kind of environment.
Okay, and next question is, how is the YouTube question asked? Is it possible people are conflating music videos on YouTube with the YouTube music platform? Good question, actually,
yeah. Well, the way we simply ask, when, if ever, did you last listen to music on YouTube? So there could be that could be whether it's purely the audio version, or it could also be the video content one as well. Yeah, but that's what we ask: listen to music on YouTube.
Okay. Why do you think there is such a large gap between smart speaker ownership versus usage?
Well, versus usage for audio content. And don't forget those measures that we were looking at were you know, in terms of share and everything was daily usage. So there's that element of it. You know, it's probably being used, but maybe not being used every day. We could see, let me just see what I think it was 10% who were using the smart speaker in the past week, was it? Anyway, so I think while people own it, I suppose it goes back to that frequency of listening using those particular devices. You know, they're used for so many other things as well. And I think it's one that will grow over time as it does begin to replace more and more the traditional types of devices that we own. You know, I suppose like everything that we have, we buy new devices, we still have the old ones. It's still sometimes easier just to go to the old devices that we have. We don't always throw things out as such. So live radio and audio, you know, the traditional device is still very much the key one that is out there. And as ownership grows, consumption on a regular basis will grow in time as well.
Just going back to the earlier question, I think the person who asked the original question just came back. It was and I just checked, it was around slide number 21 versus 22. And what slide number 21 was the average minutes listened, and music streaming is at 93 versus live radio is 183 minutes. But then you look at the share to music streaming, it's much lower. And that's because the percentage of people in total are lower than live radio, and that's why the share is lower.
And that's the exact use of seeing that chart. I suppose the percentage of live radio, of people listening to live radio, is higher, and they listen for longer. So that chart shows those minutes were among the format users. So people who listened to audio streaming, how long those listeners were listening for. So there's less of them. So obviously when we go into the share analysis, that's taken into account.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And actually, thank you. You've come back and said that makes sense.
Okay.
That is the last question. We're bang on time. It's just 1 o'clock. And the good news is the presentation deck will be available and sent to you all tomorrow, but there'll also be a full written report, so you'll be able to read the commentary, and I think there's a few extra charts in the full written report, and that will be sent to you all tomorrow. A recording of the website will also be the recording of the webinar will be available on the website also tomorrow. So please look out for the email. You'll get the presentation deck and you'll get the full report in your email inbox tomorrow. So I want to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it, and hope you have the wonderful rest of Thursday and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.